Hello, today is Wednesday, June 26, 2019. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Ben Fox, one of TC2's managing directors, and Marc Lindsey, a senior partner at LB3. And Marc is also president of Avenue 4, which is a leading IPv4 advisory firm. What we're going to do today is share our perspective on what causes IT deals to fail, plus give you some advice for fixing them when they do. Marc, how about if you kick this off with some examples of what can cause deals to fail?
Sure thing. Thanks for the introduction, Joe. I'd like to flag 3 areas that are common causes of failed deals. The most common we get called in on was when the provider, at least the customer, perceives the provider is incapable of performing the scope of services or lacks the skills, resources to meet the customer's quality and performance requirements. So they're just not able to perform. That's oftentimes the first thing a customer will cite as the reason for an unhappy, unsatisfactory transaction. But oftentimes when we dig back a little further, we see that there might be 2 other areas that come into play, and that's false or key assumptions or forecasts. Both parties structure the deal based on a set of assumptions about the forecast consumption or costs of either paying for those services or delivering those services, and they factor that into the 3 to 5 year term of the deal. If actual service delivery or consumption deviates from those initial assumptions, either party or both may perceive the other is really the reason for the problem, and that the other party should bear a greater responsibility for the financial consequences of that false assumption or those failed assumptions. Relatedly, agility and flexibility have become essential success criteria in most of our deals, most enterprise deals in the technology sector. And so customers expect that their key strategic suppliers will help respond to the changing business environment. Technology, financial, and service level requirements can dramatically change over a 3 to 5 year term. So that expectation of agility and flexibility is well grounded. Many of these deals fail, however, because the customer's requirements evolve well beyond the confines of what the original contract contemplated. And to compound the problem, the supplier may be unwilling to take the financial hit to restructure the deal, rescope the services that might actually fix the customer's changing business requirements.
Hi, Joe, and I'd add a couple of things. I think one of the points to add is that, of course, many deals suffer pain and they suffer problems during their term, but the parties work through them as just an ordinary course of business. What I think is true is that when deals truly break down, and I suppose, candidly, when folks like us tend to get involved, the problems have become quite profound. So the customer's business is really quite materially hampered by the service issues. The cost overruns are so large, they're affecting the overall IT budget. Or indeed, you see these abnormal efforts to work around the issues from the customer, things like attempting to control the user behavior, to reduce service consumption. Or interestingly, what we often see is if the service provider is kind of failing to perform, then the customer ends up just kind of taking over those services and performing them themselves. And the other attribute of a really broken deal is we see the relationships have completely broken down to the extent that key customer supplier resources are barely on speaking terms. So often when we come in that kind of situation, what the client really wants, or the first thing they say to us is, we just want to get out of this deal. We've had enough. We're at our wits' end. Help us to terminate this deal. What often happens is once we go through the details and figure out the effort and the expense to prematurely terminate a deal, and of course migrate to a new service provider, and everyone's looked at that in a cold light of day, it soon becomes pretty clear that rather than terminating the deal, the far preferable outcome is to fix it, to turn that deal around.
So, Ben, based on your experience with these kinds of disputes and workouts, what advice do you have for enterprise customers?
Well, the first thing is just like any negotiation, and this is a negotiation, it's absolutely crucial to be prepared and do your groundwork. So, for example, it's really important to document the provider's failings. And what we tend to find is we come into these situations and we get endless anecdotal stories of the service provider's failures, such as the customer gets upset about the people aren't very good, the services aren't being delivered, etc., etc., etc. But anecdotal evidence isn't that helpful. It has to be factual, if you will. So service level performance can help if you can demonstrate that the service levels in the agreement are not being met by the service provider. But at the same time, often in failing deals, we see service level agreements that are so poorly structured such that the supplier is contractually meeting the SLA despite obvious problems existing. It's also true that when part of the problem is financial, i.e. you're spending more than you thought you would be, you've really got to do the analysis to understand precisely what is causing that overspend. And in particular, don't rely on the supplier's analysis for that.
I'd also add on the homework side, right? As a contract lives on in an organization, there's different conventional wisdoms about what it says and what it doesn't say. Oftentimes those conventional wisdoms are wrong. So in this situation, you really need to dig into your contract to understand what terms and conditions can be brought to bear. Because ultimately, when you start the more earnest workout negotiations, you're going to have to be factually based, as Ben points out, and contractually based. And it can't just be looking at extra contract pain that you're suffering. So one of the things that oftentimes is the immediate source of debate is who is in breach of the contract and whether it's a breach of contract. And so figuring out what the specific obligations that your supplier is violating, being down to the clause, the section, and then supporting each one of those assertions of breach with some facts is a key bit of the homework before you start ratcheting up demand letters and requests for action. But important part of that too, this isn't just a bit of advocacy. It isn't just looking at the strength of your own case and believing the strength of your own case. It's looking for the weaknesses in your own case, looking for the weaknesses in your claims of breach by the supplier, and looking to see what claims the supplier may have against you, the customer, for breach. So they're not simply going to allow you to punch them without punching back. So looking at where there may have been some responsibilities on the customer's part that have led to the bad circumstances and exposing those things on your own internal analysis before they're brought to your attention is a much better path forward. The existing contract also can be the framework for determining both parties' expectations of what the outcome would be if they don't reach a settlement. After asserting your breach claims, damages can become a good lever. You don't want to throw out a damage recovery number to threaten your supplier to come to the table if that's not well grounded in either the facts, the actual harm, and more importantly, are recoverable under your contract. Many contracts set contract limits, disclaimers for certain damages you need to recover, so you need to really make sure that any assertion of harm fits within what's permissible and recoverable under your contract. One of the vendor's strongest leverage points is turning off service. In contracts that are well negotiated, the opportunities for suppliers to turn off services while disputes are pending are limited. But not every contract has those clauses. So you need to look very carefully to see, are there obligations of your supplier to continue to perform while disputes are pending? Are there transition support services that no matter what the cause of termination or threatened termination, that they still have some obligation to support you through a termination event? So if you're in this discussion where either party has exercised right to terminate as a constructive termination, you still have the ability to remove supplier leverage point of discontinuing service as permitted under the contract. Oftentimes, payments or non-payments are in dispute in these situations. Customers believe that if they're not getting the service they want, they can stop paying some portion of it. But looking at your particular contract's provisions or what it says or doesn't say about withholding payments is absolutely a great starting point, because oftentimes customers lose their leverage in these kind of negotiations because they're improperly withholding payments and putting themselves in breach. Even if you have a well-negotiated contract, there's frequently rights for the supplier to discontinue when they're not getting paid. So looking at when you can withhold disputes, how much you can withhold disputes, and staying within the protections of the negotiated dispute withholding rights in your contract keeps you in a position of allowing over-aggressive withholding to take away leverage on your case. There are often in these contracts, in every contract, there are time limits to these remedies. So you've done your homework, you've figured out your termination triggers, you've figured out other remedies, you understand what you can withhold. All of those things, service level credit terminations, many of those things oftentimes have a time constraint as to when you can assert them. So understanding the time constraints, knowing when you might have a right or remedy expire, and preserving it while you're in dispute will help you keep all the leverage on the table that you need. You don't have to assert the right to terminate if, for example, there's an SLA trigger that says I can terminate in these events. While you're negotiating, you do not have to assert that right to terminate, but you need to preserve it and include it in the ask in the letter to preserve your point of being able to assert that right and continue the clock to tick so that it's not lost and you're prejudiced from raising it again.
I got one point, Joe, I just want to add to what Marc has been describing, and it's that a big but not that uncommon problem is just when the supplier's contract has been poorly drafted and developed from the customer's perspective. So, for example, what we often see when we come into these things is a contract that's almost a supplier's form contract that hasn't really been negotiated that much, and so is almost inherently customer unfriendly. And what you find then is often the contract doesn't really help you at all, can be more hindrance than help, in fact. And therefore our advice to the customer in that circumstance is actually we want to keep the contract kind of completely out of the work out the dispute negotiations because it's simply not going to help us. It's better not to even mention it.
Okay, so once a customer has done all of their homework, what's next?
So the first thing, Joe, is to prepare your ask as a customer. So develop and put forward a set of precise terms and precise concessions, specific concessions you want from the supplier in order to move forward and set the deal back on its right path. And those asks have to be based on all that preparation, including the contract reviews that Marc was talking about, and a clear rationale. Put that ask in writing, such as a letter, and have it delivered to the supplier by one of your executives.
As Ben points out, you have a vendor-side contract that provides you, no help. You're going to want to cite the contract terms you're invoking in that letter, including, what you're willing to offer. You don't need to extend to the bottom line of your offering, but lay out a sign of willingness to collaborate to resolve the problems. So cite the contract that says, here's what we're relying on. Here's a summary of the facts that lay against those contract terms, and then offer some bridge to negotiated outcome that's mutually beneficial. Striking a very clear resolve to pursue all your remedies to the extent that they are available to you, while also still opening an arm of embrace to resolution, is the delicate balance of how to draft these letters to elicit the response you want, to get the earnest treatment on the other side, but also not to immediately assume and have the supplier assume that this is headed towards litigation.
And by the way, however much you want to, it's really important not to use a letter as merely a stick to admonish a supplier. So piling on the blame, avert threats, that's just not the way to put your deal back on track. So it's important to avoid those kind of things.
So Marc, what successful negotiation strategies have you seen used in these situations?
Great question, Joe. These negotiations are a lot different than structuring a deal up front. When you're structuring a deal up front, both parties are eager to reach a mutual agreement because it's in their self-interest. The supplier is getting some revenue and the customer is getting some business problem solved that for which the service or product is intended to address. But in negotiating a workout dispute or a dispute of a failed deal, it's almost certainly a zero-sum game, right? You as the customer are asserting as some outcome a loss of revenue and possibly some damage recovery from your supplier, and the supplier is looking at making less money if you walk away and seeking to extract that from you either in early termination fees or some other way. So it's all about looking at mitigating the losses. And in these situations, there is a tendency to create a hostile negotiating environment rather than a collaborative one.
And that hostile negotiating environment, what you also get is a lot of emotion. People, everyone's starting off from being upset. So you get an awful lot of emotion in these kind of dispute negotiations. And that in of itself adds a lot of unhelpful baggage to negotiation. So we have found that to offset that baggage and that emotion, it's really important and useful to pull in an outsider that can view everything much more dispassionately. And that's often the role that we play, or sometimes indeed the negotiations are simply led by a senior leader from a different part of the customer's organization. And that's extremely helpful.
It's also important to make sure that the supplier negotiator is at the right level of seniority. Oftentimes, the account team will try to kind of keep this contained, and then they're not able to oftentimes back off the concessions that might be necessary to move forward, or more importantly, they may dig their heels in based on their own legacy grievances, right? They have positioned this account in a certain fashion internally, and it's going to be very hard for them to get away from the internal anchor point that they've established as the relationship has gone south. So whether intentionally or unintentionally, parties can hinder an actual effective resolution if they've been too entrenched in the relationship over time. So the key is escalate early to get to the right level of seniority within the supplier's organization and find someone who has not been entrenched fully in the account and its failings.
And my final piece of advice for the dispute negotiation itself is to always keep in mind that suppliers fundamentally don't want unhappy customers. And that actually provides leverage in of itself. Once you've moved all the emotion, the baggage, and really regardless of what the contract says, to a certain extent, suppliers are motivated to work out the dispute with their customer. And they are motivated to find a way to get back to a happier customer. And actually that is leverage in of itself that you should take advantage of.
All right. Thanks, Ben. And thank you as well, Marc. Appreciate you guys sharing your insights on this topic that I'm sure most companies hope to avoid, but you need to be prepared if things do go south. Now let me mention that Ben and Marc recently published a really good article for CIO.com on this subject. So if you'd like a copy of the article, or if you'd like to discuss dealing with disputes, or if you have other ICT needs that you'd like to discuss, you can contact Marc, Ben, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or sending us an email. You can also stay current by checking out our websites or follow us on LinkedIn.